All right, I'm enjoying myself so much I ran out of time in the last video. We talked about this and the different interpretations of this as an important moment in the story. Here's another important moment in the story, and we'll focus on important moments and then move to different interpretations in this video. Is this a story of eco-consciousness in Nick, or only of hope and healing? It's for him, versus being, interdependent and recognizing interdependence for both. Hard to say, but here's some moments. You can interpret them as you wish, I suppose. But we have this moment on page 180, the fire and the grasshoppers. The grasshoppers are all black from the fire. This could be a slight comment on ecological balance and adaptation. These grasshoppers have made it. They look a little different, mainly because they're covered in soot. But they are still surviving, right? So that would be a small detail. And Nick notices this, Nick is ecologically minded, and the story has some commentary on ecological balance, right? Life replenishing itself in some way. So it's not a story of the fall, but it's a story of regeneration, ecologically speaking, and Nick is a part of this or noticing it. And so there's the first bit of evidence that we have of that. Other people read it like this. The grasshoppers are a parallel to Nick. They too are overcoming obstacles. They had a fire. Their terrain was devastated. Nick's psychological terrain was devastated by World War I. And so they're just a parallel to Nick. It's a little literary symbol. That's a good reading too, right? So make of it what you will, this grasshopper passage. As I said earlier, we never really know how the fire started, yet the terrain dominates a decent portion of the story. You'll need to figure out what to do with that in an interpretation. We get this about Nick. It says he wondered without thinking about the grasshoppers, and then the story moves on. He wondered how long they would stay that way, and then they were gone. So maybe he's ecologically minded here. We have some evidence. We never really get specific answers. And this story is a story that eludes answers or an easy interpretation. And that's why I assigned it. I think that's really a fascinating type of story to work with, and you can make of it what you will. And it's great for us because we can apply all these different frameworks of interpretation to this story. So we can say that nature seems to capture his attention. Nick is certainly good with nature, observant. He knows where to nap. He knows the species, whether it's the bugs, whether it's the fish, whether he knows where to find grasshoppers later when he's ready to fish. He knows where to take a nap under the pine trees. He spots that from a distance. So this knowledge and attentiveness might go beyond any interpretation that this is just nature appreciation. He seems to have knowledge of nature and even some ecological thought, if we wanted to give an ecological reading of the story. How is this an adventure story, or perhaps a story of spiritual conversion? We have to ask ourselves this question. Is it hard pastoral? Is Nick trying to explore unexplorable places? For most of the story, we could say no. If we look ahead to the very end, we know he does want to go to the swamp in the future, and that's where the fishing would be hard. He even says it would be tragic, right? So it seems like that's where the hard pastoral, the unreachable aspect of nature is. We don't see him spending time with it here. That leaves us with the question, is he trying to dominate nature? We can deal with that a little bit more when we get to the fishing. We could say he wants to catch a big fish, but in the end, he only needs to catch a couple of little ones, right? So you can interpret that, again, as you wish, whether or not he's trying to dominate nature or whether he's not trying to dominate, but live in communion with it and live ecologically with it. That is in the eyes of the beholder to a great extent. But here are some other important moments. He says, and gets into it, whether or not he's an adventurer and trying to dominate nature and using it for his own purposes. There had been, page 184, there had been this to do. Now it was done. It had been a hard trip. It's coming out here. It had been a hard trip. He was very tired. That was done. He was there. The good place. So this seems to be nature as a preserve from a fallen world. Does this mean that he is a conqueror? He needed to get out there. He was there, right? There had been this to do. Why did he need to do it? We don't know why. Is it because he needs to conquer and dominate? We could read it that way. It is part of an adventure story, and this will be the first of several adventure stories. But nature is also healing. Maybe that's what he needs, so we can interpret it that way too. Do we fool ourselves into seeing nature as spiritual? He believes he has to do this, but maybe there's actually nothing there for him, right? However, I think there is something there for Nick, and he seems happier in the second half of the story. So it seems there is some regeneration happening in here for Nick on the spiritual level, right? So this probably isn't a great reading of the story Eventually, even if at this point we're not sure, and this seems like a possible interpretation. So is he being social with nature or not, if we want to connect it back to Wordsworth? If so, the language of Nick here is very, very different than Wordsworth, who is dancing with the daffodils, right? So that's very, very different. I'll let you take a look at this. Nick speaks. I've got a right to eat this kind of stuff if I'm willing to carry it. Who is he talking to? Why is he talking? He seems to be responding to voices that he's internalized over the year in society. He must feel disempowered because there's a moment of anger or injustice here. And he's looking for rights. He's looking to rebuild himself. I have the right to carry it, right? But what are our rights in nature then? The story could be seen as probing this at this moment. To use it as we wish, to carry in human creations, to use it for adventure and sport and domination. That's our right, so to speak. So it's interesting. We have a passage where Nick is trapped in the past. His rich friend Hopkins, his fishing pole he bought for $8 a long time ago. We have to figure out, again, what the past means to Nick. Is he trying to overcome it, reconcile it, return to it? We're not really sure. The remaining portion of the video, I think I'm just going to talk through my notes. You can follow along, and I'll post these notes online as well. But Nick's fishing. We're in part 2 now. So note that Nick is good at reading the land. He's good with grasshoppers. He loses his first grasshopper. So this fishing section, part 2, kind of loaded with ups and downs, right? If we think of the fall and recovery narratives as being linear, that they're always up or always down, Nick is neither one of those. It would be hard to apply that to this, right? That Nick's totally in recovery. He has some successes. He has some problems. He loses grasshoppers. He loses fish. He's never totally and completely successful, yet he's never totally and completely unsuccessful. Good thing to notice here. Here's one interesting moment. He loses a fish, but then and loses a first grasshopper. He seems to not be very good, but he gets better. He catches a trout and releases it. This is a fascinating moment in the story. He's worried about the trout, and then he says, he's all right, Nick thought. He was only tired. Right? And so we get that right here on page 192, right? A really important moment in the story. It shows that Nick is sympathetic to animals. At this moment, it would be hard to say that he's just trying to dominate nature, because he's clearly not just hunting and fishing in some way where he cares for nothing of the land around him or the wildlife around him. So that's a fascinating moment. Nick is, in the larger picture, learning how to be sympathetic, or still has sympathy. Remember, he just fought in the war where he was asked to show no sympathy, even to people, right? And so he's finding himself again, and he's finding it in wildlife too. So this complicates any idea that he's just trying to dominate nature. Although he wants to go into the swamp at the end, which seems that he still wants to dominate or be an adventurer. So there's a sort of a mixed reading of Nick here. He's a different person at different times. So you have to make of this what you can. The next scene, he loses the big trout. His mouth is dry, his heart is down. The excitement makes him feel a little shaky and a little sick, right? So again, we could say that clearly he's wounded and looking for healing. That's why he's shaking and a little sick. We could also give at least this line of reading that he's trying to dominate nature. His heart is down when he loses the fish, right? So we don't know what to do with that, but those are important lines that you can incorporate into a given reading of your own, right? Nick had one good trout. He did not care about getting many trout on page 195. He catches 2 and then is done. Here we could say, too, he's not trying to dominate nature. This seems to lend itself also to a healing reading. He's using nature to heal. He's there just to be successful or to have the experience in some way. It certainly lends itself to an ecological reading. He's not trying to overfish. He's not trying to get the biggest trout or get a lot of trout. So again, this seems positive, and he's living more with nature and communion with nature as well. Here, it's working against a power reading of the story. He's trying to dominate nature. At the end, he did not feel like going into the swamp. Nick did not want to go in there now, but that means maybe later he does. So we could say he's not ready to deal with, he's not emotionally ready to go into the swamp where it'll be harder. He's staying where it's easier, but he still wants to dominate at some point. That would be one reading of this story. Or another reading would be he spent this entire time basically in confluence with nature, not looking to overfish it, just simply looking to enjoy it and be mildly successful, as anybody would need to be for survival. He does catch dinner in the end, and he eats the fish. So that lends itself to an ecological reading. One of the most basic interdependent relationships is animals eat each other, and he's doing that. So that fact that he catches some fish and eats them and doesn't overfish lends itself to an ecological reading. All right, so here's some other ways to interpret to close this down. If I don't get through all of them, I'll put these notes online. But the domination, power, and adventure, here's what we might say about Nick in the end with the lines and the passages that we focused on. He's not a conqueror. He's not interested in dangerous or hard-to-fish places, as we know at the end. He appreciates life and has some sympathy for the fish. They're not tired. He's worried about the fish. He also says on page 199, the fish look alive again as he cleans them in the river, and it's very exciting to him. So he enjoys the beauty of life, right? So we could read that against a different reading inside of the same sort of little hierarchy here. He is a conqueror and plans on going into the swamp the next day, right? So he's not ready to dominate nature yet, but he's building up to it. Okay, so he's ecologically sound now, but maybe he won't be in the future would be one way to read that, right? If we want to look at a final statement, a big question that hopefully we've answered by now to some degree, well, how does the river have two hearts? Well, it might have one that heals humans. This would be nature's spirit, nature's pastoralism, communion with nature. We can be social with nature. We can live inside of it successfully ecologically, even as sort of a tourist, as Nick is, so to speak. So that would be one thing that the river and nature offer us. And that's one way that humans live with nature and define it according to our needs. That's the more positive one. A second reading, this would be the second heart of the river. So the river is always the same thing. It's never just one thing. It's all these things at once. One heart that represents maybe our fears. It's more combative and based in competition with the fish and based in evolution. The river is one. The second heart represents our need to go into the darker parts of our psychology. That would be the swamp. Nick needs to overcome things in the river first and does so and does a good job, but then is not ready to go into the darkest parts of recovery or his psychology, the parts that are still wounded from the war. He's not ready to go into those yet. And so the river is a symbol of that, and nature is a symbol of that as well. How far we're willing to push ourselves physically or psychologically, right? So here for the second heart, which is a little bit more darker representation of what the river is, an existential reading. What does it mean to be here on Earth? Nick, like everyone, probes psychology and existence through nature. An ecological reading, he probes the limitations of human existence by placing us inside an ecosystem, of which we are only a small part. Nick is there, and this whole thing is bigger than him. And he could die in the swamp. He may be successful in the swamp, and it won't really matter. The second heart of the river is that human existence is no more important than nature's existence, the ecosystem's importance. Remember, for the first heart here, it seems a very, very human-based, anthropocentric view of what the river is. We use it for our own purposes, right? Even if they are positive, right? But here is where we either see the darkness that we have to overcome in ourselves, and it can represent that, or just the smallness of ourselves. So these are both based less so in positive anthropocentric readings of the river. Here's a few more course concepts we can end with. I'm not sure if I'll get through all of them. Fallen recovery. Nature doesn't seem to be fallen, but people do. Nick has been used up. You could look in my notes to read a bit more on that. If we look at nature and wilderness, you could ask how Nick challenges the typical nature binaries. Let's take a look at those quick. From the She's reading, what is this story passing on to us? How does Nick feel, so to speak? Well, he's definitely anti-modern. The world has not been good to him. He does seem to be a traditional environmentalist in that he's just kind of fitting in with nature and hunting and doing these things, but he's not a radical social activist or anything like this. No commentary on this. He seems to be the unconsciousness of nature. He's in there. He doesn't have to think much. He is one with it. He is recreating himself. He's out in the wild. Is there some wilderness there? Well, there is in the swamp eventually. So he seems to be here. That's where the story is. In this column, much more than anything else, and has a negative commentary on some of these. The only thing we might say is his biocentric views break down. He seems to be there for his own purposes, not for nature's purposes. So he's not highly biocentric, but more anthropocentric. That's where the story changes. Evidence for an ecological reading. The river survives. It is an adapted ecology despite the burnt out terrain. Nick is determined, so are the trout. They're locked into a competitive battle. It's linked to the food chain. This is an evidence of an ecological